Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about some population dynamics within ecology. Ecologists often study population growth, which is part of what we like to call population dynamics, in both ideal, unlimited conditions as well as realistic situations. So idealized situations help us understand the capacity of species to increase and the conditions that may facilitate this growth. When we look at population size and population growth, we come up with this equation where change in population size is going to be equal to the births plus the immigrants entering the population, any organisms that are going to come into the population, any individuals, I should say, that are going to come into the population. So we add those together. All right, those are our additions. And then we're going to subtract any deaths and then any ones that are emigrating, which are leaving. All right, so ones that are going to come in are going to we're going to subtract the ones that are leaving or dying from that. So if immigration and emigration are ignored, then the change in population size is simply the change of birth in population size is equal to births minus deaths. Very simple. So in population growth rate, we express this mathematically as the change in the population size, which is change in n, over the change in t, which is our time interval. And this is going to be equal to b, which is the number of births, minus d, which is the number of deaths. So you have this change in pop over time is equal to births minus deaths. All right, simple enough. So the population growth equation is often revised to look more like this, where we see that the change in the population over the change in time is equal to the difference between B and D, which is our R. And the per capita or per individual change in population size, which is our R delta T, which is going to represents the contribution that an average member of the population makes to the population size during the specific time interval or during the time that we're talking about. So for example, for a population of 1,000 individuals that increases by 16 members per year, well, now we're talking about 16 over 1,000 is going to end up being this ratio. So or this decimal. So now we can take this decimal and we can apply it to other numbers and say that if we had a larger population with the same type of increase going on, if that's really the rate of increase. So if we see that that's the rate of increase always, well, now if we have 2,000 individuals and we multiply that by 0.016, we're going to see that we end up with 32 members. So now you can take this number, and obviously if I go from 1,000 to 2,000, you're just multiplying it, but by creating this number, it makes it much easier for me to say, well, what would be the number if it was 1,250,078 individuals. Okay, what would be the number of individuals that would increase for that population? So we create this equation in order to apply it to an ideal situation, even though things aren't always perfect and it's not a perfect equation. That's going to definitely tell you because there's so many other factors that play into it, but we can come up with a general idea of really how many individuals will increase for this specific population. And remember, keep in mind, we're talking about a community. Community is all the different types of individuals. Well, when we're talking about a population, it's one type of species. So although you might have a carrying capacity of wolves of only 50, well, the carrying capacity of deer in that area might be 2,000. So it really depends on which species, which organisms we are talking about. So the formula R equals um, uh, capital R equals lowercase r change in Tn can be used to calculate how many individuals will be added to a population each year. For the example, we created that number. It shows us that shows us what is the change over a year, and the population size is 500. Well, now we take our 500, we multiply it by our number, and now we have 8 per year. So change in population size can now be written as the change in n over the change in t is going to equal our change in our population over a specific time. So population growth can also be expressed as a rate of change at each instant in time. So we have this difference in the population over the difference in time is going to equal our difference in our number of individuals. So when change in n over change in t represents very small changes in population size over a small or short period of time, which is, when we're talking about instantaneous intervals. So exponential population growth is population increase under idealized conditions. We see that, humans are going to exponentially grow in population size. Under these conditions, populations may increase in size by a constant proportion at each instant as well. So you have R is the intrinsic rate of increase per capita rate at which an exponentially growing population increases in size at each instant in time. And we're going to talk about this more as we move forward. So exponential population growth results in a J-shaped curve. All right, you're going to see that if we have a graph, it's going to go up exponentially. All right, it's not going to be constant like this. Okay, it's really going to have this effect where, 1 doesn't become 2 and then 2 becomes 3, but 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, and it creates this J-shaped curve. So the J-shaped curve of exponential growth characterizes some rebounding populations that previously had very low numbers, but they are making a resurgence. So, for an example, elephant population in this national park, for elephant refuge, you're going to see a growth exponentially after that they banned hunting and they started to protect the elephants. So while you have a time where they were constantly kind of going down rapidly. Then once they banned the poaching, now you see that they're going to increase. And when they do increase, they are going to increase exponentially. All right. So when you see that, starting here and it exponentially increases, that is going to be our J-shaped curve of exponential growth. So here you go. They show you how it goes up. And, I just created this because obviously the elephants existed before this and they didn't just start at this low number. Somewhere along the way, maybe they were up here and it went down. They don't show you that part of the graph. But the J shape that we're talking about is where it's very low and then it exponentially increases. So it cannot be sustained for long in any population. You even see that with human population, and there's all these different people that debate what is the carrying capacity of humans, because in reality, if it wasn't for all the technology we had and our big brains, we wouldn't have the amount of people in the world that we currently do. We wouldn't have 7 billion people. Approaching 8 billion people, we just wouldn't have that. But because of all the technology and our big brains were able to really push the limit. But now they're saying, well, even with those things, what is the carrying capacity? When is it that, all right, people cannot, there's not enough, there's too many limiting factors, there's not enough resources for everyone to survive? Can we have 9 billion people? Can we have 10 billion people? Can we have 20 billion? It just doesn't make sense that it could exponentially go on forever. So after a long period of time, it's not going to be sustainable and you're not going to see that exponential growth forever. So a more realistic population model limits growth by incorporating this carrying capacity. And when we look at things like carrying capacity, we like to draw them on our graph. So you might have your J-shaped curve, but we like to draw them sometimes as like dotted lines. And we'll say, hey, that's the carrying capacity. So what you see is that, yeah, if it was hurting, if you have this uh, population of organisms and the carrying capacity is this high, but for whatever reason, say for poaching of the elephants, a lot of them were killed and they start down here. Well, they can exponentially go up, but once they reach this carrying capacity, you're going to see now there's that idea of they're fighting over resources and they're going to only be able to hover around that imaginary line that we create that we have determined, that carrying capacity that we like to determine as K. That's the maximum that the environment can support. That's our carrying capacity. So it varies with the abundance of limiting resources. Obviously, the carrying capacity of a desert is going to be different than the carrying capacity of a temperate forest or a rainforest. It really depends on the organism you're talking about as well as the environment that you were talking about. So in the logistic population growth model, the per capita rate of population growth approaches zero as the population size nears carrying capacity, right? It's not going to, we're not saying that there's going to be zero organisms, but the growth is going to be zero. So we show it as this equation right here, where you're going to have your change in the population over the change in time is going to be equal to your R times N times your carrying capacity minus your N over your carrying capacity. So when N is small compared to your carrying capacity, the term carrying capacity minus your number divided by your carrying capacity is close to 1, and the per capita rate of population will be close to the R. But when the N is large compared to your carrying capacity, this term is going to be close to 0. So if we go back and we look at this, all right, we're talking about this right here. If it is close to 1, then we know that it's going to be um, uh, that the n is small, we're going to know that it's going to be close to 1. But when the n is large, we know that it's going to be close to 0, and the per capita rate of population growth is going to be small. So if you have your large n and it's going to come out as close to 0, this specifically is going to come out close to 0, and you're going to see the growth is small. So when n equals k, the population stops growing. And here they give you some examples of hypothetical populations where you have your n, or your population size, is 25, and if we say that our R is 1 and we have our k minus n over k is close to 1, you're going to have 25. But as you decrease the your k minus n over k, as it gets closer to 0, you're going to see that your population growth rate is going to approach 0. So the logistic model of population growth produces this sigmoid curve that we like to call S curve. So you have J curve, you have your J curve of your exponential growth, you have your S-shaped curve of your logistic model, and the population growth decreases as n approaches your carrying capacity. So here they show you how, in exponential growth, it may go far past that. But in your logistical and even with exponential growth, eventually it's going to have to make its way back down to your K, or your carrying capacity. But with our logistic model, we see that it is going to slow up as it approaches. So where exponential is just very rapidly going up and it's breaking through that carrying capacity, and then you're going to see substantial or drastic decreases in the population once something happens where it does start to really spill over or really backfire. It's going to then make its way back down to the carrying capacity. Where the logistic growth, we see that it slows up, right? This area right here is where it's slowing up. Here it doesn't slow up. If you see in your J-shaped curve, it's not slowing up, but in your S-shaped curve, it's as you approach it, you see that this is kind of flattening, right? You hear about flattening the curve. Well, this is where it's flattening right here. And with the exponential growth model, we just don't see that. So, but with both of them, carrying capacity doesn't matter. I don't want you to think that, oh, in exponential growth, carrying capacity doesn't matter because it just goes right through. No, we see that with the logistic growth model. It kind of slows up as it approaches that carrying capacity, and then you don't have that drastic decrease in the population. You don't have that the whole thing kind of blow up in your face. So the growth of laboratory populations of Paramecium fits an S-shaped curve, and we see that when we, anytime you're going to do an experiment with Paramecium, we know that they are going to as they approach that carrying capacity of their environment, they're going to slow up their population growth as time goes on. So if they exponentially grew, we might see that the graph looked more like this. But since they follow that logistic growth model, they slow up, and you have this area right here where this is the slowing up, and it actually um, kind of levels off nicely with the carrying capacity. So this is our carrying capacity right here, and it levels off nicely, opposed to if they exponentially grew, they would go past that carrying capacity, but then eventually they would see a rapid decrease. So some populations overshoot K before settling down to a relatively stable density, which is what I talked about with the exponential growth model. Other populations are going to fluctuate greatly and make it difficult to really figure out what carrying capacity is for that population, and it really depends on year to year. You look at things like um, complex organisms like deer. Well, it really depends on was it a good year for the plants? How what about the predators that are around? Are there a lot of predators, a little predators? And there's so many other factors that really, and that's where we see those fluctuations from season to season and from year to year in those populations. So logistic model provides a useful starting point for thinking about how populations grow. We have conservation biologists are going to use the model to really predict things like population recovery, estimate sustainable harvest rates, as well as the size below which populations may become extinct. So things like deer, people go deer hunting, and people think it's a terrible thing, but actually the DEC is keeping track of the population growth rate and the population size, and they're able to come up with these models to figure out how many deer tags, because if you're hunting deer, you're not allowed to just go out and shoot 6 deer in a day. You have to actually have tags, and you have to tag your deer, which says, hey, you know what, I'm allowed to take 1 doe today and maybe 1 buck, and that's it for the season. So when you think about, oh, people are killing deer, that's terrible. Well, the DEC is actually having those hunters help them to keep the deer at a level with the carrying capacity of their environment, and that allows for deer to really have healthier populations, because now instead of that deer population getting out of control and more of them getting hit by cars and more of them starving to death, you're kind of weeding out some of them and keeping that population healthy. So when we talk about life history, it comprises the traits that affect the schedule of reproduction and survival. So when you're talking about life history, the big thing is reproduction. When is it going to reproduce? How is it going to reproduce? What does this involve? So some traits that you talk about are going to be about the development of them, their physiology, as well as their behavior. So um, 3 key components are going to be the age at first reproduction, or when we say that they've met reproductive maturity, and how often the organism is going to reproduce, and how many offspring are produced per reproductive episode. So you think about different organisms, and you see that organisms have these three components are very different from one organism to the next. You look at something like an elephant's going to have 1 offspring each time they have children, and it takes them, I think it's 22 months for them. They are pregnant for 22 months after conception for them to give birth, and they only have 1, and maybe they only reproduce so many times in their lifetime because they reach reproductive maturity, and then they're only able to have so many offspring before they're too old or they die. So you look at something like that, opposed to looking at other organisms that are, something like a cat. Well, cats, they say that 1 cat or 1 rabbit before it dies can be responsible for something like 20 or 30,000 other cats or rabbits. Not that they are having that many, but before they die, their offspring, since they can have a litter of say 8, well, those 8 are then going to have a litter of 8, and those 8 are going to have a litter of 8, and before they die at say 16, well, they could be responsible for 30,000 other cats or rabbits. So that's very different from what we see with the elephant. Things like insects, well, insects, they reproduce once, they have tons of them. You think about fish. Fish are going to lay thousands and thousands of eggs, and not many are going to survive, but they're going to lay many eggs, and maybe they only lay eggs once before they die, or and they only do it once a year. So all of these things are very different from one organism to the next. So species that exhibit semiparity or Big Bang reproduction reproduce once and then they die, and then you have species that exhibit heteroparity, which or repeated reproduction, produce offspring repeatedly throughout their lifetime. So you have one-time reproducers, and then you have repeat reproducers. So different plants reproduce differently. Organisms vary widely in the number of offspring they produce when they do reproduce, and species that produce one or few offspring may provision them better than species that produce many offspring. So there's this idea of being a K strategist or being an R strategist. And we are actually K strategists, and K strategists are going to, for the most part, take care of offspring, where, excuse me, things like fish are going to be R strategists, and they're really going to produce a lot and not really teach them anything, not going to worry about them. They're just going to hope that some of them, or as many as possible, can survive on their own and are going to live long enough to reproduce, because that's what it's all about. We talk about evolution. It's all about being able to reproduce. So it's two different types of strategies. So you have trade-offs of life histories. Organisms have finite resources. They don't have infinite resources. They have a finite amount, which may lead to trade-offs between survival and reproduction. So there's a trade-off between survival and parental care of European kestrels. All right, these birds have a trade-off where you're going to see the parents surviving the following winter. You see that a normal brood size is going to have about 60%, and an enlarged brood size is going to have even less. But if you reduce the brood size, that's going to be the best. So for them, the best is if you have this reduced brood size. So selective pressures influence trade-offs between the number and size of offspring, and it really depends on which population or which species you're talking about. So some plants reproduce a large number of small seeds, ensuring that at least some of them will grow and eventually reproduce, and then you have other ones that are going to do the opposite. And with when we talk about case selection, it's the selection for life history traits that are advantageous at high population densities. And you have R strategists, which is going to be the traits that maximize reproductive success at low density. So sometimes you'll see they'll draw these as graphs, and when you look at the graphs, you'll see that, all right, if we look at number of survivors. So if I draw a graph, and this axis is my y-axis represents the number of survivals, and I draw my x-axis, and this is the percent living for the lifespan. Okay, you're going to see that you're going to have, right? So if this is the lifespan, all right, say, for something like a human, maybe it's 0 to 100 years old, okay, and maybe for something else it only goes up to 20 years, but for humans, let's say, so for humans, they are going to be K strategists, where you're going to see that they are going to slowly decrease. So at old age, they are going to die very rapidly. When you have things like fish, all right, their chances of living a long life is not very good. They die very young. A lot of the eggs, if we were to average everything, a lot of the eggs are not, or the larvae are not really going to make it, and that's why we see a curve that's more like this. Okay, so here you see that you have your R strategist, and this is our K strategist, and then there's also an intermediate, which is this is like a constant kind of selection going on. And sometimes you'll hear them call this as our type 1 strategist. This is our type 2. And this is our type 3. And it's not to say that anyone's better than the other, but these are the three models that we look at, and the kind of cost to benefit ratio and why organisms reproduce the way that they do. There are two important questions about regulation of population growth. You have what environmental factors stop your population from growing indefinitely, and why are some populations fairly stable in size while others are not very stable. So with two things that we talk about is you have density independent populations where birth rate and death rate do not change with population density, and then you have density dependent populations where birth rate's going to fall and death's going to increase with rising population density. So there's two different things to look at. So one density dependent factor can regulate population size. And we see in the textbook they give us kind of a graph of this. So there's also intrinsic factors, which for some population, the intrinsic or the physiological factors appear to regulate population size. And we talk about the study of population dynamics, which focuses on the complex interactions between biotic and the abiotic, the non-living factors that cause variation in population size. So keep these things in mind